Welcome to the channel again. Today I've brought self-evaluation test of the chapter The Address by Marga Minko. Now here I'm going to share the theme, the title, the extracts along with the self-evaluation test and the character sketches. But before that you need to watch MCQ test 30 questions from the chapter The Portrait of a Lady and a Photograph. So it is your quick revision and your quick preparation. Now let's go on to the self-evaluation test of the address. First we have the theme. The address is a story of a human predicament that follows war. Comment. Now this is the back exercise question, and this question, it includes the theme of the story. So that is why I have combined the theme along with this question. Now, the address is a touching story, a sentimental vent for the narrator that portrays the plight of the innocent people who were caught in war. So, war here is the Second World War. For no mistake of theirs. The oppression of the Jews and the uncertainty of the war had forced many Jewish families to go into hiding. Many were targeted and victimized, looted, and forced to go into concentration camps. So, this is the reality of the time during the Second World War. So that is the background of the story. So therefore, it is a very touching story, a sentimental vent for the author because she was a part of that tragedy. So the life of the well-to-do Jewish family of the narrator is shattered because of the war. The narrator loses her family to war, but she survives only to witness deceit, betrayal, and selfishness of one against the other and face the human predicament, which she beautifully highlights in the story. So, all this is there in the story. She is the survival, the only survival. अपनी फैमिली में से सिर्फ वही बचती है, लेकिन वो क्या देखने के लिए बचती है? Deceit, betrayal, selfishness of other people who want to take advantage of the situation, and of course the human predicament, the trying situation, the challenges that she has to face. So all this she has very beautifully portrayed in the story. However, the story also speaks about finding hope amidst hopelessness. Somehow, the narrator braves the trying time, but what follows is an emotional upheaval. So, this is the story of human predicament. The story brings forth the opportunist attitude, selfishness, and insensitivity of people like Mrs. Dorling, who intend to fill their homes by taking advantage of the situation. It is pathetic to see Mrs. Dorling grabbing the antiques and other expensive items of the narrator's family on the pretext of keeping them safe. After the war, the narrator is troubled with memories of her past. But when she decides to confront her past, she receives a cold reception from Mrs. Dorling, who refuses to recognize her. She feels emotionally defeated as her mother had shown great faith in Mrs. Dorling. Her second visit at the address serves to be the final nail in the coffin for her. Looking at her mother's possessions, rather than reviving an emotional intimacy with them, she feels oppressed and disappointed and resolves to forget everything about the address and those possessions and move on with her life. So, this is the theme of the story. The theme, obviously, the past, it is painful. There is suffering in the past, but still, in the past, she has memories of her mother. And once she decides that she would like to connect to those memories again, what she receives is cold reception. But even then, she moves on. She decides to look into the brighter side of life. She wants to go after hope. So, therefore, in the end, she decides and she resolves that she would forget everything about the address and she would move on in her life. So, this is the theme. Now, let's move on to the title. The address, number 46 in Marconi Street, forms the core of the whole story. The address, written by Marga Minko. The mother of the narrator insists the narrator to remember this address, as this is the address of Mrs. Dorling, who takes away the prized possessions to keep them in her safe custody during war. These things are very dear to the narrator's mother, and therefore she expects her daughter to go to the given address and take back what belongs to them. The narrator does remember the address, but gets a cold reception by Mrs. Dorling when she reaches there. The second visit to the address proves to be the deciding one as she finds herself amidst familiar things but at an unfamiliar place. The tasteless way in which her mother's beautiful artifacts and kitchenware are placed estranges her from the memories attached to those things. She is not able to connect to her mother's things at that address. Rather, her visit to the address pains her. She therefore resolves to forget the address for good. Thus, this poignant story that begins with a knock at the door of the address ends with the resolution of forgetting that address. Hence, the title is apt and justified. So, if you've seen, the whole story revolves around that address. So, different things are attached to that address. For mother, that address has her dear belongings. For daughter, that address has memories of her mother. But once she reaches there, she receives a cold reception at that address, and then in the end, she resolves to forget that address. That is why the title is apt and justified. Now we have the self evaluation test. So there are 20 questions, including 5 extracts. So I won't be reading the questions. You can pause at each slide to read the question if you want to answer the questions on your own first. After the 20 questions, I have all the answers for you. So it's your choice whether you want to go straight to the answers or you want to read the questions. So these are the extracts. 5 extracts here. You can pause and you can read the extracts, try to answer them, and then have a look at the answers. First 5 questions. I've tried to include all the important questions for your preparation. Title is discussed already. Theme is already discussed. Five extracts and these 15 questions. So there are 20 questions in all. I'll be taking the answers now one by one. These are the answers. So first, the extract-based questions. First extract is, she had opened the door a chink. I came closer and stood on the step. So who is she in the above line? She is Mrs. Darling. In reference to the given context, chink means, so chink here means narrow opening. Then why does she open the door a chink? So she didn't want the narrator to have a look inside the house because the things inside belong to the narrator. So she obviously is Mrs. Darling. She did not want the narrator to have a look inside the house because the things inside the house, they belonged to the narrator. Then who is I in the given line? The narrator is I in the given line. Then what is I doing there? The narrator is there because of the possessions of her mother that Mrs. Darling had taken during war to keep them in her safe custody. She wanted to take them back. So narrator had gone there to take the things back. Now next one. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything I asked? So who is the speaker and to whom is she or he speaking? The narrator is the speaker of the given line. So I have not written to whom is she or he speaking. So she is actually speaking to her mother. Now what does the narrator mean by everything here? Now she is referring to all those things that Mrs. Darling had taken with her. What is the narrator asking? The narrator is asking her mother if she had allowed Mrs. Darling to keep her possessions forever. So this is what the narrator wants to know. Now next one. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. And think about the risk she was running each time she goes out of our door with a full suitcase or bag. Now, what according to the mother was not necessary? So according to the mother, it was not necessary to tell Mrs. Darling that after the war, things would become, I'll read it again. So according to the mother, it was not necessary to tell Mrs. Darling that after things would become better, they will take their possessions back. So now mother never wanted to tell Mrs. Darling directly because she felt that it would be an insult to tell the lady because she was trying to help them. Now why according to the speaker it would have been an insult to talk like that? Now the speaker felt that in those tough times Mrs. Darling was helping them by taking their expensive possessions with her to keep them safe. So it would have been an insult to tell her that they will come back to take those possessions. The mother felt that it was understood. Also, being a soft hearted lady, she felt that Mrs. Darling was all the time risking her health by picking such heavy suitcases for the sake of keeping their things safe. So that is why she felt that it would be an insult. The next one. In Marconi Street, said my mother. Number 46, remember that. So I have just taken the main question from this extract. Why did the mother ask the narrator to remember the address? Now, the address of was the address of Mrs. Darling, who had taken their expensive possessions on the pretext of keeping them safe till the war was over. The narrator's mother gave the address to her so that she could get their stuff back from Mrs. Darling when things become normal. Therefore, she wanted the narrator to remember that address. So, therefore, she insisted that narrator should remember that address. Now, the fifth extract, that's a nice box. I heard my own voice. It was a strange voice, as though each sound was different in this room. Now, which box is the narrator talking about? The narrator is talking about the box the girl had opened to take out some spoons. Why was it a strange voice? The voice seemed to be strange to the narrator because she was complimenting her own things. Explain, as though each sound was different in this room. Now, this is important. There were different sounds in the room. The sound of the teapot and the teacups as the girl poured tea. The sound of the spoons as the girl opened the box to take them out. So all these items, they were familiar to the narrator as these belonged to her mother, but still each sound was different in that room. This was because they were placed in an unfamiliar surrounding and she was not able to connect with those things as she had hoped to. So now, if you carefully read the line, it says, it was a strange voice, and then as though each sound was different. So, voice here refers to the narrator's voice, and sound refers to the things, the non living things. So, that is why it's different. So, we need to understand the difference here. So, I hope that it is clear. Now, we come to the next 15 questions. So, first one, her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. Do you think the woman had actually not recognized the narrator or she was pretending? Give reasons to support your answer. Now, after the narrator had introduced herself to the woman had recognized the narrator, but she pretended not to recognize her because she didn't want to give all the expensive things and antique stuff that she had brought from the narrator's mother on the pretext of keeping them safe back to her. Also, she was not hoping anyone from the narrator's family would come back. She held the door tight to prevent it from opening any further and gave a very unfamiliar look. So, she didn't want to recognize the narrator because she didn't want to give any of that stuff back. How was the narrator received by the woman on her first visit to the woman? The narrator received a very cold and indifferent reception on her first meeting with the woman. The woman was not at all happy to see her at her house. She rather became upset at her arrival and tried to avoid her. Third one, at one point even the narrator felt that maybe she was at the wrong address. Now, how did she then realize that she was not wrong? Or how was the narrator convinced that she had come to the right address? Then, if a question is describe the narrator's first meeting with Mrs. Darling, so we have to combine these two questions if this question comes. Describe the first meeting. Because question number 2 says that how she was received, and the next question says that at one point when narrator felt that maybe she was at the wrong address. So, all this happened during the first meeting. So, if a detailed question comes, we'll be combining these two answers. So here's the third answer. Now, when the woman gave a very cold reception to the narrator and gave no sign of recognition, even after the narrator had introduced herself to her, the narrator felt that she was at the wrong address. So at that point, narrator felt that maybe she was at the wrong address. She felt that it was a long time back when she had just had a glance of this woman. So maybe she is not able to recognize the woman, and perhaps she had even mistaken the address. But when the woman stepped a little back to close the door, the narrator recognized the green knitted cardigan which the woman was wearing to be her mother's. Looking at the cardigan, the narrator realized that she was at the right address. Even the woman noticed that the narrator had recognized her. So at that point, even the woman realized that the narrator had recognized her. So this is the description of the first meeting. Now, next question. What was the reason for the narrator's visit to Mrs. Darling's house? The narrator was the Dutch Jew. During World War II, the Jews they were targeted and oppressed. She had thus left along with her mother for safety. But before that, Mrs. Darling, on the pretext of taking care of their expensive stuff, had taken those things with her. After the war was over and things became normal, the narrator was back to see and touch the belongings of her mother and remember her as she was no more with her. Therefore, she visited Mrs. Darling's house to revive her connection with the past. So, she wanted to revive her connection with the past. She wanted to feel her mother close to her. Fifth one. What did the narrator feel about the rooms of her house when she came back to her home during the first half of the war? When the narrator came back home during the first half of the war, she immediately noticed something strange about the rooms. She felt as if something had changed. She missed various things from the room. Her mother was surprised to see that she was quick to notice the missing items from the room. What did the mother tell the narrator about Mrs. Darling? The narrator's mother told her that Mrs. Darling was an old acquaintance whom her mother had not seen for years. But suddenly, their contact was renewed, and since then she had been paying regular visits to them. Her mother also told her that every time Mrs. Darling visited, she took something with her. She had already taken their table silver, antique plates, large vases, etc. The narrator's mother did not suspect Mrs. Darling at any point. She rather seemed grateful to her for keeping their possessions in safe custody. So, this is what the mother told the narrator about Mrs. Darling. Now, seventh one, explain. I did not want to go further than was necessary, or the narrator avoided looking at the things around her on her way back to the station from Mrs. Darling's house. Why? On her way to the station from Mrs. Darling's house, the narrator found herself to be in familiar surroundings. She didn't want to retrace those streets, lanes, buildings, or shops as they would upset her. She decided not to go to the places that would bring back the memories of her past. So she decided not to go any further than was necessary. Exploring any further, it would only have pained her. So वो ऐसी किसी भी जगह पे नहीं जाना चाहती थी जहाँ से उसकी पुरानी यादें वो ताज़ा हो जाएं. वो सिर्फ उन्हीं जगह पे जाना चाहती थी जो ज़रूरी थी, जैसे कि मिसेस डॉलिंग का हाउस. तो रास्ते में कहीं और कहीं नहीं जाना चाहती थी. Now, why had the narrator taken a long time to return? Though the narrator had remembered the address, she took a long time to return because she didn't want to come face to face with the things of her past, which would revive memories from her past. She would be confronted with things that belonged to her mother, who was not alive. So she was not interested in those things, rather, she was afraid to face them. For this reason, narrator took a long time to return. Then, why did the narrator decide to pay a second visit to Mrs. Darling? After the liberation, the narrator did not have any desire to go back to have a look at those stored things. But gradually things they became normal. And one day she had an urge to go back at that address and see, touch, and remember her past attached to those things that belonged to her mother. But then one day there was an urge. So she wanted to go and have a look at those things. Why was the narrator horrified when she entered the living room at Mrs. Darling's house? The narrator was horrified when she entered the living room of Mrs. Darling on her second visit to her because she found herself amidst familiar things that emanated unfamiliarity. वो familiar चीज़ों के बीच में तो थी, लेकिन जो surrounding थी वो बिल्कुल unfamiliar थी. The strange surroundings oppressed her. She felt detached at the tasteless way the things were placed, the ugly furniture, and the muggy smell that hung around distanced her from her possessions that she would wanted to see, touch, and remember. But now she didn't want to look around the room. So the ugly furniture, the muggy smell that hung around, so all this distanced her from her own possessions that she wanted to see, touch, and remember. But now she didn't want to look around the room. So that is why she was horrified. Now, looking at the teapot from which the girl poured tea for the narrator uttered to herself, I remembered. What does this signify? I remembered signifies that the narrator was able to recognize the teapot from which the girl was pouring tea for her as her mother's. Even after a long time, the narrator remembered each and every item of her mother. It also signifies that the memory of the things you love and hold close to your heart never fades away, even after a long time. 12th question. What did the narrator tell the girl about the silver? The narrator told the girl that once her mother had asked her to help her in polishing the silver. She said that her mother had never asked her to do anything before, so the narrator didn't know which silver her mother was talking about. Her mother was surprised to know that the narrator did not know that the cutlery they ate of every day was silver. She told the girl that she was sure that she didn't know that either. 13th now. Why did the narrator leave Mrs. Darling's house in such a hurry? The narrator had gone to Mrs. Darling's house for the second time to have a look at her mother's possessions and revive her connection with the past. Since Mrs. Darling was not at home, she decided to wait. Mrs. Darling's daughter took her inside the living room. The narrator was horrified to see her mother's belongings placed tastelessly amidst ugly furniture. She felt alienated amidst her own things. She was disappointed to see the things being used carelessly. Rather than feeling connected, she felt estranged. Thus, she left the house in a hurry. So now she didn't want to meet Mrs. Darling anymore because she was not interested in her own things. She was not able to connect with those things. 14th. Why did the narrator resolve to forget the address? Why did she feel that it would be the easiest? The narrator had gone to the address given to her by her mother to revive her link with her past memories. The memories that were connected to the things that once belonged to her family. So that is her mother. She had an urge to see and touch those things which she believed would have been kept safely in the cupboards or packed in boxes, waiting to be put back at their right place again. But when the narrator reached there, she found those things in a strange surrounding that alienated her from them. To her, the things that at that time had lost their value. She felt distant from them. Also, she realized where she would have kept those things in her small rented room where space was very less. So she saw those things being used by strangers. She saw those things placed amidst ugly furniture, and they were placed in a tasteless way. So all this alienated her from those things. And she even realized and felt that where would she keep all these things because her rented room was very small. So rather than regretting the happenings, she decided to move on in her life. To see the brighter life ahead, she had to forget the dark past, and for that she felt that the easiest thing would be to forget that address. So that is why she resolved in the end to forget everything about that address. So this is an important question here. Now 15th is the character sketches. So I have given all the three character sketches. First, Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling is an old acquaintance of Mrs. S. They were not in contact for quite some time, but during World War II they resumed their contact and Mrs. Darling starts visiting Mrs. S very often. Mrs. Darling is a greedy and sly woman who doesn't let Mrs. S suspect her real motive behind taking her expensive possessions. Very cleverly, she convinces Mrs. S to let her take the responsibility of taking care of her prized possessions. She doesn't wish good for the family and therefore is surprised to find Mrs. S.'s daughter at her doorstep one day. She has always hoped that the family would perish in war and she would enjoy the ownership of all the exotic stuff. This portrays her as a selfish and insensitive woman who is always ready to take advantage of others. So, this is the brief character sketch of Mrs. Darling. Now, Mrs. S. Mrs. S is the mother of the narrator. She is a simple Jewish lady who has faith in humanity. She belongs to an affluent family. She takes pride in her antique collection and other exquisite items in her home. She fondly takes care of all her things. During the difficult time of World War II, she trusts her old acquaintance Mrs. Darling and allows her to take away all her prized possessions and keep them in her safe custody. She fails to understand the real motive of Mrs. Darling behind it. Although her daughter expresses her doubts at this, but Mrs. S quietens her by pitting at the difficulty Mrs. Darling faces in carrying their expensive stuff. She cares about the emotions of others. That is why she tells her daughter that it would be an insult to ask Mrs. Darling that they will take their stuff back when things would become normal. So this is Mrs. S. She's simple, very caring lady, very gentle lady. Now the narrator. The narrator is the daughter of Mrs. S. She is a Jewish girl who lives in Holland with her mother, Mrs. S. She is the only survivor from the family in World War II. She goes through a lot of emotional turmoil during the war and loses her mother to war. She even loses the prized possessions of her mother the only memory of her to the greed, selfishness, and insensitivity of Mrs. Darling. She is a practical girl who understands human nature better than her mother. Therefore, she is not convinced about Mrs. Darling's so called good intentions behind keeping their stuff in her safe custody. She is quite attached to her mother and thus is not able to gather enough courage for a long time to go back and see, touch, and remember her mother's belongings, as it would bring back the memories from the past. But at one point she is overwhelmed by the urge to bring back what belongs to her. With the aim of reviving her old connection with the things, she goes to Mrs. Darling's house the second time, only to be disappointed. Her visit to the address given by her mother not only brings forth the true colors of Mrs. Darling, but also assists her in taking a decision to move on. Thus, we find her to be a strong woman who believes to live in the present. That is why, in the end, she rightfully resolves to forget the address forever. So, this is the narrator. So, these are brief character sketches and 20 important questions for your preparation. That's all for today. So, do subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Instagram. If you have any queries, do write in. I'll always answer back. And before going, give this video a thumbs up. And next, I'll be bringing up MCQs and the poem Childhood. So till then, happy watching.